I'm the building substitute at Souderton Vantage Academy. I started this year's professional development process with the first and second year teachers, but Jesse Walsh invited me to join the other teachers. He said that I wouldn't be required to do one of these TED Talks because, as a sub, the opportunity to test a hypothesis about instruction over the course of a unit might not present itself to me. But I was welcome to give it a shot. Back in November, I was preparing a presentation about free schools at the invitation of Jeff Kaler. The invitation arose out of my interest in a substantial body of research that had been excluded from Hattie's study. I never made the presentation because an insufficient number of people signed up, so I'm going to use the material originally intended for my November presentation here. Apologies in advance if this wastes your time, and apologies in advance if I occasionally adopt a combative tone. A combative tone comes naturally to me. When the world I live in demands that I surrender my beliefs and deny what I know to be true, I fight. You know how washing your hands can greatly reduce your risk of catching a cold? Well, 90% of the issues and challenges addressed in the Hattie research is rendered moot in the world of free schools. The fact that so few people in our corner of this so-called profession have had any contact with free schools actually makes me sick. So please don't take offense when I refer to our profession as a racket. I don't hate the player, I hate the game, and I hate the game of school. Quote, "Study after study shows the single most important factor determining the quality of the education a child receives is the quality of his teacher." Unquote. I grabbed this quote from greatschools.org. I put the words in quotation marks and did a search in an attempt to ascertain who actually said or wrote these words. And though it's quoted in more places than I bothered to count, it's often cited as having come from greatschools.org, maybe a staff writer there, who knows. But variations of those words have been rubbed in my face for as long as I've been involved in teacher preparation and professional development programs related to schooling. And most people eat that up. Teachers accept it as self-evident. Go ahead, pat yourselves on the back. You really think it's all about you, and it ain't. Let me put that in perspective. For about a decade, I worked with kids in placement, kids who'd been removed from their homes for being ungovernable or because their homes were unsafe, and also kids who'd stepped down from more restrictive psychiatric or juvenile detention settings. These kids received a place to live, a balanced diet, medical care, access to fitness and sports programs, a budget for clothes and toiletries, a budget for recreation, counseling, therapy, access to a spiritual development program, structured day with regular hours for a good night's sleep in a warm bed in a safe room, an education provided by patient, loving, well-trained teachers like me. It costs a lot to keep kids in residential care. Let's say $200 a day, or $6,000 a month, or over $70,000 a year. It sounds like a lot, doesn't it? I know homes with 5 kids that run on less than $70,000 a year, but kids almost always did well in the residential environment. Upon returning to their families or communities, though, kids almost always found themselves in trouble again, and again, and again, and again. The programs weren't really making kids better. And it could be argued that the programs may have made some of the kids worse. Right under the nose of well-meaning adults, you're learning how to pierce yourself, how to give yourself a tattoo, how to smuggle contraband ranging from bubblegum to morphine, how to have sex in unsupervised corners and closets, how to get high from whiteout, how to get high from psych meds, how to hoard and sell your psych meds, how to shoplift, how to pick a lock, how to steal a car, how to break into a house, how to run away and join a perfectly benevolent sex trafficking ring, etc. All the normal things of growing up. Well, then somebody came along and asked, what was the effectiveness over time of these expensive programs? And they discovered that most kids outgrow delinquency in their early 20s. No intervention at all was as effective as these very expensive residential programs. So the judges who placed kids in residential programs for mere delinquency were told to look for other alternatives, intervene in the homes, in the schools, in the communities. Now, those of us who worked with these kids have been told by these kids that we touched, changed, and saved their lives. Some can even say that we saved their souls. But evidence-based, outcome-based, blah, blah, blah says whatever we did wasn't worth the expense. Now, I'm sure a lot of us as teachers in the public school system have also heard that we've touched, changed, and saved lives, and no doubt we do. But the evidence has been in for decades. Students educated without curricula, without compulsory classes, and even without schools do, on the average, just as well as those who are the product of public education. You can debate the numbers, the sample size, talk and dance your way around it. But it's even worse. Students who have been homeschooled, free-schooled, or unschooled are accepted to elite institutions at a higher rate than those who have attended public schools. I wish to God somebody would come along and say, there is no evidence that public schools are more effective than no school at all, so we're going to stop pumping money into the system and stop forcing families to send their children there. This really hurts. Schools that can honestly advertise themselves as no homework and recess all day have outcomes as good or better than yours. Oh, by the way, No Homework and Recess All Day is an actual book title by Jerry Mintz, head of AERO, the Alternative Education Resource Organization. And I'm going to back these claims up. But first I need to insert a thought right here. A few moments ago, I ran through a litany of the many evils likely to be encountered by kids in residential programs, and it sounded pretty bad, right? Well, I'm sure you know that there is about 150 years' worth of literature commenting on the evils that take place in the classroom. Crushed spirits, dulled minds, lights that smolder and go out. And the answer to these horror stories is supposed to be better prepared teachers with greater resources and innovative techniques and the incentive of greater pay. Money solves everything. And that's where Hattie's research and Madeline Hunter come in. But a good number of the schools of the type I'm going to tell you about were started by desperate parents whose kids hated school, unhappy kids, and parents who loved their kids so much that one day they simply said, that's it. If it makes you that unhappy, I'm not sending you. You're staying home with me, and we'll find a way. And though there's a multitude of educational approaches that consider the happiness of the child, the prototype of the school based entirely on individual freedom and self-governed community is A.S. Neil Summerhill. It was founded in England in 1921. That's the original no homework and recess all day school. Now, schools in the tradition of Summerhill were known as free schools, till the 1960s came along and corrupted the word freedom. Everybody started associating freedom with chaos, and chaos is dangerous and unpleasant, so a new branding was required, and free schools became democratic schools. And a democracy is a good thing, right? Well, mainstream schools started allowing students to vote about inconsequential things like, what kind of soda should we put in the vending machines? And they're claiming that that's democracy in action. So they killed democracy as a brand. And so the new thing, a lot of the schools call themselves Sudbury Valley schools. The original Sudbury Valley School is in Framingham, Massachusetts, and it insists it's not a model. We do us, you do you. Use our name if it helps, but if you have to figure this stuff out on your own. So I'm going to tell you mostly about a few schools that I have followed from a distance over the course of the past decade or so. Number one, the Highland School, a day and boarding school in the remote hills of Ellenboro, West Virginia. Two, the Philly Free School, which is located in urban Center City, Philadelphia. And three, the Circle School, which is a day school right off the interstate, 76, 81, and 83, where they all converge in Harrisburg. Now, the Highland School calls itself democratic. The Philly Free School is obviously hailing itself as free. And the Circle School has coined the term integral education. But, each of the schools adopt the same basic approach: unwavering commitment to individual freedom, a self-governed community, and faith in human beings of all ages to be natural learners capable of discerning and acting in their own best interest while balancing their needs with the needs of those around them. Now, these are private schools, and some are even classified as religious schools. And because they aren't competing for government dollars, they don't even care what you or I think. They answer to themselves. But Jim Rietmulder, he's the founder of the Circle School, he sees the value of being prepared to put up some numbers. Go against you, beat you at your own game. So this comes from Jim Rietmulder of the Circle School, which is, as I said, a no homework and recess all day type school. Quote, "Our graduates go to college at high rates. 84% of those who were here for 4 years of high school, and 91% of our lifers. Nationwide, the rate among the same age peers is 60%. Our graduates also earn more bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees than their peers, and 21% are currently pursuing degrees that aren't even counted in this study. Clearly, the Circle School has excelled in these customary measures of success. How does this happen? In a school with no compulsory curriculum, classes, tests, grades, or homework? How does this happen with students from across the socioeconomic spectrum? I'm going to end the quote right there because I have to interject something. It works across the socioeconomic spectrum, but it also applies to the behavioral, emotional, and cognitive disorders that constitute the world of special education. Those kids without TSSs and without one-on-ones do beautifully in these democratic environments. So back to the words of Jim Rietmulder, quote, "But in bragging about this aspect of the Circle School's excellence, I don't want to endorse the narrow, inadequate, unhelpful obsession of public policymakers with curriculum, academic studies, testing, and grades. Academics in college are important facets of life, but they are not what the Circle School most values. As the study says, the Circle School's primary aims are about children's personal fulfillment and engagement in society. We would rather be judged by our graduates' self-actualization, life satisfaction, achievement in self-chosen domains, and productive engagement in culture, community, society, and technology. I want every child to have ample opportunity for the happiness of a satisfying life filled with meaning and purpose. I don't want children to postpone pursuit of that sort of deep happiness until tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. I'm pleased now to show that kids can live their lives as kids today, every day, practicing life at school, and still grow up and go to college." Okay, so what do kids at these schools do? Oh, this is really going to hurt. They hang out with their friends. Now, there's a podcast you can check out, the School Sucks Project, led by Brent Vainot. And they did a cross-country road trip visiting innovative educational alternatives, including a stop at the Circle School. And they asked the kids at the Circle School what they did. And one kid said, insightfully, something to the effect, and I'll paraphrase this, he says, "I hang out with my friends." Now, when you as an outsider think of me hanging out with my friends, you think of 2 or 3 things. But those of us here know that hanging out with my friends might mean 300 different things. And here's an uncanny coincidence. I visited the Highland School, the Circle School, and the Philly Free School back in October and November 2017. And just in the course of open-ended conversation with teachers and students at each of these schools, I heard the same comment: "This is the hardest thing I've ever done." And you probably ask yourself, what could be so hard about hanging out with your friends? When we're talking about education, so many people are talking about preparing children for the future, equipping them with the skills that we know that they will need for the future. But, free schools, democratic schools, Sudbury schools, they talk about education as living right now. For example, the Circle School talks about education as practicing life in a setting that's based on 4 fundamentals. Number 1, personal freedom. Number 2, mutual toleration. Number 3, public government. And number 4, free, responsible markets. And when I first met Jim Rietmolder back in, I think it was 2006, he described the Circle School as running just like the United States, with, an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. You couldn't possibly be any more prepared for self-government and being a true American than you will be when you come out of one of these free schools. So that thing about hanging out with your friends, how hard is that? Well, you're not just hanging out with your friends. You are running a school with your friends. You are responsible for creating the laws and enforcing the laws. These are the words of the Circle School. School meeting runs the school like a principal, headmaster, or chief executive. Students and staff, but not parents, are members of the school meeting, each person having 1 vote and equal right to make motions and speak in debate. Meetings run formally by Robert's Rule of Order. In weekly sessions open to all members, school meeting hears reports from its officials and committees and considers proposals in the form of motions for executive and legislative actions. School meeting also hears appeals from sentences given by the Judicial Committee, the JC, and occasionally hears recommendations from JC to suspend or expel. Now, while I was there, one of the parents did tell me that she thought the Judicial Committee was a little too fast to suspend and expel, but it happened. Likewise, when I was visiting the Highland School, there was a student, or a former student, who was on grounds, and it was explained to me that they were sort of being given an audition because they had been previously expelled a couple of years ago, and now they wanted to see if maybe that student was ready for this environment once again. Okay, back to the words of the Circle School. Alleged rule violations are heard by the Judicial Committee, comprising 5 rotating members and bound by due process and the rule of law. No staff member or committee can override or veto the actions of school meeting. The Circle School students are fully empowered citizens and active creators of their community and their lives. And now I'm going to give you some examples of rules. Like I said, the Circle School's rule book is as thick as a phone book. Here's Rule 9.6. Each person is expected to refrain from behaviors which jeopardize the well-being of the school. Now, that's pretty broad. That could be a judgment call. But obviously, you're not allowed to break the law. If I caught you outside behind the building smoking a joint, you're jeopardizing my school. I'm going to bring you up on charges. If you're playing with matches or, looking at dirty pictures on the internet, whatever, you're jeopardizing the well-being of the school. I have the right to bring you up on charges. And if you're found guilty, the judicial committee will establish some kind of restitution or, as we would call it, restorative justice. Here's another rule. This is rule number 10.17.3. It is prohibited to jump from stairs indoors. Skipping over the last step on the way down doesn't count as jumping for the purposes of this law. Right? So the kids take safety seriously. You're not allowed to jump down the stairs. You have to walk. You can only skip the last step. Here's rule number 10.21. It is prohibited to use sticks with a diameter of 2 or more inches or a length of 4 or more feet for stick fighting. These sticks may be used for forts, swings, and toy bazookas. I guess that implies that they do a little bit of stick fighting and they build forts, swings, and toy bazookas at the Circle School. Here's another one, rule number 12.16. Paper airplane makers must write their names on the airplanes they make. I guess they make some paper airplanes as well. Okay, now, over in West Virginia, when Candace Landvoigt, who's the founder of the school, she's also a professor at the University of West Virginia, she was afraid to let the students have full judicial power. She was afraid to let the students be responsible for safety. She really felt that was the domain of the adults. But what they found was that as long as the students believed that the adults were in control and would step in and exert their authority, the students themselves didn't really seem to take the authority seriously. She said that the adults on occasion had to stop students from fighting with knives in the flats between the school and the creek behind the school. And that's pretty extreme. She said that as soon as the school became fully democratic, placing full responsibility for regulation on the students and self-regulation on the individual, that kind of crazy, risky behavior stopped. As long as I'm responsible for your behavior, you feel free to take risks, and it's my fault if you get hurt. But if you're responsible for your own behavior, your assessment of what is and what is not risky suddenly changes. The judicial process I'm talking about really demands a lot of the students, and we're talking, kids as young as 4 and 5 years old who must advocate for themselves, participate in the democratic life of the school. They learn to think clearly, express themselves clearly, understand the rules, understand the limits. Really, the daily life of the school, this I just hang out with my friends, is all about self-regulation and metacognition. Self-governance and participation in the community. Learning in the free school environment is, by definition, strength-based and purpose-driven. You explore, you find what you love, what you enjoy, and you build off of it until your interest is exhausted, and then you move on to something else. But your efforts are 100% of your own volition and of your own steam. Nobody is forcing you to do anything. And from the teacher's point of view, that means nobody is ever wasting your time. They're only coming to you when they really want your help. And so what you have is the difference between discipline and discipleship. Now, I'm making a huge leap here. I'm going to quote John Taylor Gatto from my hometown. He's actually from Monongahela, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, same town as Joe Montana. And he's one of the leading voices in the free school movement, written a number of books. One of his most famous is called The Underground History of American Education. Now here's quote Gatto. Wherever I go in the United States these days, I hear of something called the crisis of discipline, how children are not motivated, how they resist learning. That is nonsense, of course. Children resist teaching as they should, but nobody resists learning. Now, later in the same book, here's more John Taylor Gatto. Quote, the good student is literally a disciple of discipline. The words are from the Latin disciplinare. I don't know how to pronounce Latin. Disciplinari, discipulus. Sorry, I butchered it. But by the way, again, these are the words of Gatto. By the way, I learned this all from a school teacher in Utica, New York named Orrin Domenico, who writes me, and I pay attention. In this discipline matter, I'm Orrin's disciple. The most famous discipline in the Western tradition is that of Jesus Christ. That's true today, and it was true 1,500 years ago. And the most famous disciples are Jesus' 12 apostles. What did Christ's model of educational discipline look like? Attendance was not mandatory, for one thing. Christ didn't set up the Judea compulsory school system. He issued an invitation. Follow me. Some did, some didn't. Christ didn't send a truant officer after those who didn't. Orrin tells me that the first characteristic of this model is a calling. Those who pursued Christ's discipline did so out of desire. It was their own choice. They were called to it by an inner voice, a voice we never give students enough time alone to possibly hear. And that's more true of the good schools than it is of the bad ones. Our present system of schooling alienates us so sharply from inner genius, most of us are barred from ever being able to hear our calling. Calling in most of us shrivels to fantasy and daydreams as a remnant of what might have been. Continuing to quote Gatto, the second characteristic of Christ's discipline was commitment. Following Jesus wasn't easy. You had to drop everything else, and there was no chance of getting rich. You had to love what you were doing. Only love could induce you to walk across deserts, sleep in the wilderness, hang out with shady characters, and suffer scorn from all the established folks. Still quoting Gatto here. The third characteristic of Christ's model of discipleship was self-awareness and independence. Christ's disciples weren't stooges. They had to think for themselves and draw their own conclusions from the shared experience. Christ didn't give many lectures or handouts. He mostly taught by his own practice and through parables open to interpretation. Orrin, my coach, personally doubts Christ ever intended to start an institutional religion because institutions invariably corrupt ideas unless kept small. They regiment thinking and tend toward military forms of discipline. I don't think he's right about Christ's intention, but it's hard to disagree about institutional pathology. Finally, Christ's model of discipline requires a master to follow, one who has himself or herself submitted to discipline and still practices it. The way Orrin puts it is this: Christ didn't say, You guys stay here in the desert and fast for a month. I'll be over at the Ramada. You can find me in the bar if you need help. He didn't begin his own public life until he was almost a rabbi, fully versed in his tradition. One way out of the fix we're in with schools would be a return to discipleship in education. During early adolescence, students without a clear sense of calling might have a series of apprenticeships and mentorships, which mostly involve self-education. Our students have pressing needs to be alone with themselves, wrestling against obstacles, both internal demons and external barricades to self-direction. End quote. Now, while I'm on this Jesus thing, I have to admit there's a lot to bristle about in the writings of A.S. Neal. I'm a born-again Christian. I'm pretty sure he was not, but he believes in freedom. And one thing is for sure, you cannot come to Christ any way but of your own free will. So really, if you want a true Christian school, you gotta have freedom. Here's a telling thing about Summerhill. It's a boarding school. Years ago, kids voted to have co-ed dorms. Co-ed dorms, oh my. Can you imagine what those kids will be doing? But one man, one vote. One person, one vote. Well, the school was founded in 1921. Now, this may have changed, but as of 2006, they had never had a pregnancy. It's well established that the most important variable in a girl's becoming pregnant as an unwed teenager is her lack of self-esteem. There's a whole twisted pathology at work there, but not at Summerhill. The girls at Summerhill, right, a no homework recess all day, co-ed dorms, but they do not get pregnant. And I think it has something to do with self-respect and a purpose-driven life. So the language and concerns of the free school movement have a peculiar overlap with the buzzwords and concerns of my Christian faith. And one last thing, I really got to wrap this up. Graduation. You graduate from a free school by defending a thesis. And the thesis can be quite simple. I believe I'm prepared for the next phase of my life, and I've proven this to myself in the following ways. Maybe I've been accepted to 3 different colleges. Maybe I've been accepted into the plumbers union, whatever. But your closest friends and teachers are presiding. They question you, grill you, fully understanding that if you choose to leave, you're free to leave. But they aren't going to jive you. If they don't think you're ready, they're going to tell you so. The whole point is that you are prepared for life.